I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to first of all pay my regards to the Honorable Minister, Shri Pratap Chandra Sarangi, who's the chief guest of this program. He himself is from Orissa, and I think he's looking after the wonderful sectors of MSME, fisheries, animal husbandry. And I'm sure that he has done a lot of noble work for this sector, particularly the underprivileged and the needy. And I would also like to thank Mr. Ramachandru, the former Additional Chief Secretary and a very dear friend and a batchmate who's your chief patron. I did have a brief opportunity to go through your work, Shanti Dham, which has, I believe, done laudable work in the last 14 years for the underprivileged children. And when I looked through your entire body of work, I was very impressed by the fact that you have also branched out your activities to the specially able and specially needed children. And I must say that when we did host a program called the Divya Kala Shakti, I remember Mr. Sarangi had taken so much interest. He came up on stage and met some of the artists, and some of the best artists were from the state of Orissa. I thought I should mention that. I would also like to mention Dr. Ambika Das, President of Shantidham Foundation, and Dr. Sobhagya Rautre, Founder and Chief Functionary of Shantidham, all the Commissioners of Disabilities and members of the Shantidham Foundation. Let me give you a brief background about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, of which India is a party, and we are in the Conference of Parties. We ratified this treaty in 2007, and soon after we looked at amending our Persons with Disabilities Act. And now we have something called the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, which is a very strong act. It's a rights-based approach. And I think it's the first of its kind in India. And the fact that we have been guaranteed equal rights by the Article 14 of the Constitution, and also liberty by Article 21 of the Constitution, the directive principles of state policy. But this actually, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, enunciates the full spectrum of how to empower the disabled persons from the point of view of their social empowerment, from the point of view of removing stigma, their access to healthcare, their access to inclusive education, and accessible infrastructure, accessible tools for education, assistive devices, and economic and social empowerment. And I think it's a very comprehensive act. And it was enacted in 2014, notified in 2016. Since then, we have been able to get 31 states and union territories to actually notify and get the Rights of Persons with Disabilities rules in their states. And soon after the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act came, the reservation of jobs for the disabled persons from 3% to 4%, and for higher education to 5%, has been a landmark sort of step by this government. And the Honorable Prime Minister himself has taken a lot of initiative to see that the disabled persons must not have any inconvenience in terms of food, in terms of inclusive education, in terms of assistive sort of devices, in terms of modes of expression like the sign language. We have a sign language center which has actually developed a 10,000 word dictionary, which is now being adapted to the NCERT syllabus for the hearing impaired. Let me also tell you the number of categories of disabilities have increased from visual impairment, hearing impairment, or the sensory impairment, or the locomotor disability, which are physical in nature, to intellectual, to neurodevelopmental delays, to actually dwarfism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, even disabilities like thalassemia, sickle cell, hemophilia, all disabilities, including mental illness. So the 21 categories of disabilities spreads from the sensory physical to intellectual to neuro to blood disorders to mental illness. And therefore, the task for us is that much more challenging, because we need to start building human resource capacity to have more trained professionals. And we also need to address, building faculty and research scholars for the programs like mental illness, which were muchly one of the neglected areas in terms of medical health. But when we look at medical health for the mentally ill persons, we find that the anachronistic way of treating them through electroconvulsive treatment or through confinement is now soon after graduating to counseling, to seeking help, and to non-stigmatizing them, and to see that in early stages of intervention, we are able to prevent chronic depression, we are able to prevent manage bipolar and schizophrenia, which could be heredity mental illness problems. We also look at neuro and muscular delays, which leads to delays in cognitive or arrested brain growth. Such children also can be brought out from their constraints and from the delays in cognitive and motor skills development by early intervention care. But for shortage of human resource, we have started all these early intervention care in our national institutes, which are pace-setting institutes in terms of research, in terms of actually training people on how to address the problems of children who are autistic, children who may have, cerebral palsy, who may have been deprived of education and, inclusive education for the simple reason that, we had prejudices or we didn't have the right kind of infrastructure and assistive tools and devices to include them in the normal schools and colleges, as the case may be. But with this affirmative action of giving reservation, and also to ensure that we must include them in the social and economic empowerment, and see that their intellectual and academic growth must not be subverted. We find that we have today 20 visually impaired civil servants in the IAS, and we have actually people like Ira Singhal, who's from the dwarfism category. She topped the civil services exam. And very many cases like this, where you will find that given the accessible universities, colleges, if the schools and colleges have braille libraries, if they have text to speech, if they have accessible, where the electronic formats of Hindi or English or regional languages, as the case may be, are made accessible to them through smartphones or through NCERT audio textbooks, or through sign language interpretation or sign language videos or audios, videos, as the case may be, you will find that the visually impaired and the hearing impaired children can do much better than the others, because their brains are more focused, and even in mathematics and science, you'll find them scoring 100 on 100, or even when they are competing with the others in terms of skilling, and in terms of taking up opportunities in working in areas of self-employment, or where certain corporates have engaged them. We find that when you measure their output, they are doing much better than most others. So perhaps there has been a social a social prejudice or a social stigma, which somewhat delayed their participation, full participation, and their growth. But often in history, when you find that such people were the great innovators and inventors, we found that we must correct history, and the Rights of Empowerment of Disabilities and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities actually seeks to do that all over the world. And in our country, I think we are the only country which has got a legislation in place, and where we are taking affirmative action. And I find that from 2016 till date, 31 states and union territories have actually adopted and notified all the rules, and the implementation of reservation for jobs, quota for higher educational institutions, getting the in the new education policy, we have chapters 6 and 14 that are dedicated to creating accessible infrastructure classrooms, and also from the primary stage itself, including such children in the all-round cognitive and motor skills development. You have found that often the Honorable Prime Minister is, mentioning about the toy industry and, the enabling sort of assistive tools and devices, whether it's sign language, which can enable children who have special needs can with such tools and devices, they can be a multiplier force in their way of learning, in the way of adapting to sort of curriculum in a manner which helps them learn concepts and see that, numbers, numeracy and literacy is something which they are not denied. And by way of, inclusive education, by way of having sign language interpreters or assistive tools and devices, we find that their developing concepts, learning numeracy, literacy becomes much more easier than actually pushing them to special schools where they would just learn a repetitive kind of a behavior of learning how to make candles or learning pottery, which really doesn't stand in good stead unless it's an additional art, because when such children are left behind by their parents, and even if they are sort of given a legal guardianship, often because of the fact that their cognitive and motor skills were not developed properly, they just don't realize their inheritance value or the value of how to sort of lead an independent and dignified life. So this is the reason why we want that all NGOs and civil societies who have been our valued partners in bringing a sense of governance, management, and social inclusion must not sort of overlook this point that their cognitive motor skills development at the early stages between 0 to 6 years is very important for their all-round growth and for their independent and dignified life. I often find that even learning disabilities like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, we are finding a sort of means and ways of how to address the learning sort of, skills and developing the curriculum for such children. I find that often when I interact with the parents of such children, they have gone through the grueling experience of having suffered, their children's inability to sort of comprehend or read words and letters or recognize numbers, but they had tremendous creative talents, whether that be art or whether that be sort of, craft. But I would say, even if they have a very sort of, gifted quality of some sort of, creating wonders in art and music or in craftsmanship or, in an artistic work, the development of the cognitive and motor skills between 0 to 6 years, when the brain is recognizing, or responding to an external stimuli of rehabilitative treatment, has become so important for their independent living. We often found that, the district health intervention centers where such children would be identified with the problem of disabilities, whether it's intellectual or physical, the health program officers or the health professionals could not make a breakthrough in their treatment, because this was primarily a rehabilitative therapy, which meant that a composite team of special educators, clinical psychologists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, or sensory sort of, enabler teacher could, with a sort of virtual environment where you would help the child to balance, to speak, a speech therapist or an audiologist would be able to bring out the best with the involvement of the parents. So we are trying to create such virtual centers of early intervention in our national institutes and also in the composite regional centers. We are trying to also restructure the entire thinking and philosophy of rehabilitative treatment, which would come in handy not only for specially able children, but also for the aged or for people who go through trauma, people who have mental illness, because it's the rehabilitative treatment uh, which is a distinct treatment separate from medical science, must be developed in terms of its of the fact that evidentially we have proved that such treatment has reversed the process, mitigated, or have brought such children out of the morass which they would have otherwise had to live in, and giving confidence to the community and parents to visit the centers and to ensure that even home-based care through through audiovisual or through simple regional language audiovisual method, they could carry on with the treatment, despite the fact that during COVID times they cannot visit the centers. So the speech and the cognitive abilities and the motor skill abilities of the child comes out, and he may not be fully coming out of the constraints that he was born with or he might have acquired, but to a great extent, during the early intervention period, we find remarkable improvement in such children. I would also like to say that we have, skilling programs for such children. We have scholarships, pre-matric, post-matric, and top class, even overseas scholarships. And we find that such students are wanting to go abroad to learn very, very high levels of academic disciplines like astrophysics or space technology. And often the child may have had some special learning disabilities, or may have had some, may have been orthopedically handicapped, but yet the confidence and the support that he got from his parents and the support that the government extends to him, that he's able to think ahead of his time and he's able to achieve much more than the other children. So I would say that civil society organizations like the Shanti Dham Foundation and many such parent organizations and the NGOs have done uh, wonderful work, I think, historic in terms of monumental achievements, in terms of the empathy and bringing in their experience to the entire disability sector and the rehabilitative sector, as the case may be. We have now come of age to realize that rehabilitation science must go hand in hand with the medical science, and they do not need to work in conflict. They can work in concert, in congruity, to make such people independent and Atmanirbhar, as the Honorable Prime Minister often has been mentioning, for the country and for the entire human society and the human race. We would also like to say that uh, there's a legal capacity which we must address in terms of the child when he needs it, when his parents have left this world. So we have an organization called the National Trust, where they would work with such parents organization and the local level committees or the state nodal agencies, and such children are given the right to have a legal guardianship or a limited guardianship for their inheritance, for the legal capacity to to access a court or the government, as the case may be. And it's the government's duty to go out of its way to find out if the intent and the purpose of the legal guardianship relationship which they have brought out must be addressing the genuine needs of the person in terms of his human rights, in terms of his legal rights, and in terms of his rights of succession and right to property and right to access to good health care and such other needs. Even for girl child who are disabled, there's a special provision for them that in the poverty alleviation schemes, there must be a percentage share for them. 5% of the poverty alleviation schemes must be dedicated to people who have special needs, and ration cards will have to be provided for, and all of them who are below poverty line must be given food security under the National Food Security Program. And so much so that even land allotment and housing allotments must go to such people, and every government has been requested that the rights of persons with disabilities under Section 37 must be implemented with with full vigor, so that such children must not be left behind. We do our best to also provide loans through the National Handicap Financing Corporation in a composite manner or an individual manner. We are also trying to look at the COVID times when they would be sort of working from home. They are more vulnerable to infection, especially the visually impaired, who would need to work on the basis of sense of touch and feel, so that exemption from attending office had been provided for during the very peak sort of times of lockdown. But we are trying to see that a reasonable accommodation, their sense of comfort and their sense of sort of, being closer to proximity to their parents or to their guardian must also be respected. But having said that, I would say that all categories of disabilities would be needing a lot of stakeholder participation in terms of, education, in terms of the parents' confidence, community sort of, resilience, and also to ensure that all our civil society organizations must document their experience of how they have been able to bring about a composite and a comprehensive sort of rehabilitative program in terms of their education, in terms of providing rehabilitative therapy, and also in terms of their dignified and independent living. We in the department are going out of our way to ensure that railways must be sensitized to see that the coaches are earmarked for such persons. Concessions are provided for their traveling purposes, and we have a UDID portal where such persons can online apply for certifications. So all the assessment guidelines of how to assess such children, giving flexibility to the state governments to engage sort of private doctors where there are no government doctors, go on a campaign mode and give them the certification. And their certificates can also be put in the DigiLocker so that they don't have to go again and again for certifications. And the certificates would help them sort of get their skilling needs, their scholarship schemes, their employment opportunities, accessing, government schemes, both state government and central government, as the case may be. We are trying to see that, while infrastructure in terms of buses and public transport must also have earmarked sort of sitting places for such children, and the buses, whether they are low floored buses or buses in the rural areas which has narrow doors, and the height of the bus is such that the ramps are not possible to provide accessible sort of alignment of these buses with the platforms where they can alight from the buses, they get onto the buses, and they are able to take their wheelchair along. And the helplines would need to be provided, the sensitivity of how to deal with such persons, give them possible foldable ramps wherever, and giving them earmarked positions, giving them bus stops and bus terminals and bus stations and railway stations that are accessible. Toilets all over should be unisex accessible with horizontal and vertical bars and low height commodes, whether it is a sitting style or a squatting style of commode, whether it's Indian or Western. A certain percentage of the community toilets also must be made accessible. And the philosophy is that while we are making infrastructure, education, and public transport systems and websites accessible, we move towards a universal accessible system, which actually makes our society, our country, that much more sort of efficient, that much more sort of enabling all of us to bring in more robust and dynamism in the systems, by way of which everything becomes accessible, knowledge becomes accessible, infrastructure becomes accessible, public transport becomes accessible. The universal design of curriculum of learning is such that it does not leave behind any child in terms of his ability or his disability, that it brings in full cognitive and motor skills development, and to also ensure their full participation in culture, in art, in sports. We are also dedicating a international sports center in Gwalior with all accessible features as a tribute to their wonderful performance in the international events where they have won various sort of gold medals, silver medals, bronze medals, and has brought a lot of accolades to the country and to themselves. We have started the Mental Health Rehabilitation Institute, where we have tied it up with the Disability Institute in Melbourne. We are trying to bring in research scholars on mental illness, on depression, on prevention of suicide. There's something called the copycat suicide, how to prevent, suicide amongst, it's very much preventable, and also to ensure that suicide is not treated as a criminal offense, to decriminalize, and to ensure that depression and anxiety, these are very much treatable. We have started a Kiran helpline in 13 languages, where people can access it and get the first line of counseling, referral, and get the psychiatrist who are, when prescribed drugs, clinical psychologists and rehab psychologists who can counsel the rehab professionals as the first line of counselors, to work together to ensure that there's a seamless kind of counseling and a rehabilitation provided for in terms of the entire spectrum of mental illness, starting from depression to obsessive compulsive disorder, to anxiety, to phobia, to neurotic type of problems. So I would say that I can't cover the entire subject, but I wanted to give as much information as possible. Our website is there, so please feel free, and you're most welcome to get in touch with our department whenever. And of course, Ramachandra is a friend. Thank you so much, and wish you all the best.